Pakistan's borders intersect South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and China, placing it at the crossroads of global trade and security. Consequently, superpowers have poured massive capital into Pakistan to secure their strategic footprints, from U.S. military aid to Chinese infrastructure investment. But that influx of foreign capital creates a stark macroeconomic paradox. While billions enter the state apparatus, the domestic economy underneath remains severely fractured. Pakistan struggles with persistent poverty, soaring food and energy inflation, and extreme institutional fragility. This happens because the state relies heavily on geostrategic rent. Instead of generating wealth purely through domestic industrial output, the government monetizes its geography, exchanging its political and military alignment for external financial support. Relying on strategic rents has constructed a highly specialized political economy. It builds a system that empowers central elite institutions, demands the continuous privatization of public resources, and systematically suppresses local democratic governance. In 1947, Pakistan inherited a state with severe structural deficits. It lacked a functional industrial base, had very few trained administrators, and was immediately overwhelmed by a massive refugee crisis. These economic pressures were immediately compounded by the conflict over Kashmir, creating an existential security threat on the eastern border with India. Facing dual economic and military vulnerabilities, the state sought rapid external alignment. Pakistan joined Western defense pacts, specifically SEATO and CENTO, to ensure its survival. Aligning with the West unlocked massive inflows of United States military and economic aid throughout the Cold War. But this type of capital behaves differently than domestic tax revenue. Because it was tied to geopolitical security, the vast majority of this aid was routed directly into Pakistan's defense and central administrative institutions, largely bypassing civilian economic development. This established a defining maxim for the state's foreign policy. There are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. The urgent requirement to survive those early years permanently skewed the institutional balance. The economy became hardwired to extract capital from foreign geopolitical conflicts, rather than investing in local industrial output. When external capital concentrates in a few central institutions, it disrupts the constitutional separation of powers required for a functional democracy. This chart illustrates Pakistan's GDP growth. The shaded blocks indicate non-democratic military rule, like Ayub Khan in the 1960s and Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s. Notice how economic growth peaks aggressively during these periods of centralized control and drops sharply during civilian gaps. During the 1960s, strong government planning and state support pushed GDP growth to 6.8%. Pakistan rapidly expanded export industries like textiles, cement, and steel. But this boom contained a fatal structural flaw. Because it was engineered under an authoritarian system without broad public participation, the resulting wealth pooled almost entirely at the top, enriching a narrow elite. This concentration of wealth and political authority in West Pakistan fueled deep-seated resentment in the eastern wing. When the central leadership refused to transfer power following the 1970 elections, these long-standing economic and political grievances escalated into a civil war and the eventual creation of Bangladesh. Even when civilian rule is restored, as it was during the 1990s decade of democracy, the centralized power structure remains intact. Elected prime ministers repeatedly found their governments subverted and dismissed through constitutional loopholes like Article 58(2)(b). The continuous influx of strategic rent ensures that specific institutions operate with authority that exceeds the Constitution. The result is a system where democracy functions at the ballot box, but remains institutionally hollow. When global alliances inevitably shift and the strategic rent dries up, the state is left with massive budget deficits and soaring inflation. To stabilize the economy, Pakistan frequently turns to the International Monetary Fund. These IMF bailouts come with strict conditionalities, primarily the enforcement of structural adjustment programs. These programs mandate three economic levers: liberalization, privatization, and deregulation. Geographer David Harvey identifies the core mechanism here as accumulation by dispossession. Under this model, neoliberal governance does not generate new economic growth. Instead, it uses state policy to transfer existing public wealth into commodities controlled by private investors. The empirical record in Pakistan demonstrates this transfer. In 2005, the government privatized the Karachi Electric Supply Corporation, followed by the Pakistan Telecommunication Company Limited in 2006. The immediate outcomes were severe. The state lost valuable revenue-generating assets. Thousands of employees were removed, while consumers paid higher utility prices. At the same time, deregulation removed crucial fertilizer subsidies for the agricultural sector. Small farmers faced insurmountable production costs, forcing them to sell their land to large corporate entities and migrate to urban slums. Between the loss of jobs, rising utility costs, and the displacement of small farmers, the state's transition to neoliberalism shifted the burden of survival onto the most vulnerable. This structural realignment fortifies an elite culture of contentment while expanding the ranks of the marginalized poor. This macroeconomic concentration creates an impossible administrative bottleneck. A highly centralized, debt-burdened state simply cannot manage the daily municipal needs of 240 million diverse citizens. This map shows how wealth centralization accelerates geographic inequality. Development funds cluster heavily around primary power centers like Lahore and Karachi, leaving South Punjab, Balochistan, and rural Sindh chronically underdeveloped. The historical extreme of this centralization occurred in 1955 with the one-unit scheme, which dissolved the western provincial borders to merge the entire region into a single administrative bloc. That system collapsed 15 years later. Top-down administrative structures that attempt to erase regional linguistic and cultural identities cannot survive the friction they create. Today, structural resistance against local governance persists. While a three-tier system of district, tehsil, and union councils exists on paper, heavy bureaucratic overrides, often exercised through deputy commissioners, block actual fiscal authority from reaching the grassroots level. Provincial elites consistently resist devolving power downward. Releasing financial and administrative control to local councils means relinquishing their monopoly over development budgets and political patronage. Because local populations cannot access funds or political representation through their union councils, their grievances escalate. This structural bottleneck fuels ethno-linguistic demands to carve out entirely new provinces, driving movements in regions like South Punjab and Hazara. Demands for new provinces represent a desperate administrative response to a system that hoards strategic rents at the top and starves the periphery. Pakistan's recurring economic and political crises function as the mathematical outputs of a state structured to extract external rents. Foreign rent forces elite centralization, which requires neoliberal dispossession, weakens local governance, and triggers domestic crises that send the state searching for its next strategic bailout. This geographic trap ensures global survival, but causes structural vulnerability at home. Escaping requires fracturing the model, ending rent-seeking, and transitioning to domestic productivity. True economic independence demands strict constitutional supremacy. It requires abandoning elite policies for investments in human capital and infrastructure. To save the structure, power must flow downward. Protecting the 18th Amendment's provincial autonomy and enforcing local devolution builds an economy serving citizens over geopolitics.